All right, YouTube. Today there was a sort of prisoner transfer between the Cubans and the United States, and the general sense that Cuban-United States relations are now thawing, that they are being eased, and that Obama has sort of taken the helm in what the Republicans would classify as playing nice with a communist regime, but what others would frame as essentially breaking the ice after decades of rather nonsensical embargoes. On this issue, I have to side with Obama. I have to say he is right, I believe, objectively speaking, on the Cuban issue. The embargoes have largely just kept the communists in power by giving them justification to lie to their own people and say that we're responsible for every ill in the world. We see the same thing in Venezuela, by the way, that the sort of actions that we take economically towards these countries largely are propping up the regimes that are making them shitty in the first place, because anytime something goes wrong, Great Satan United States is responsible. That's been a continual facet of Cuban-US relations, Venezuelan-US relations, and I think, this is what I think, I like to look at things in the scheme of the bigger picture. Everyone's focused right now on, but they're commies, they're our enemy or something like that. Now, they don't pose an actual threat to us and haven't since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Those missiles were withdrawn. The Cubans aren't a nuclear power. They're not a major military player even in their region. They don't have the capability to do anything to us. The idea that they're anything other than an isolationist repressive regime is stupid. That's all they are. I would say this. And this is why I'm slightly excited. I think we have to look at this act in the context of what is happening currently in Russia and Venezuela. Not just with oil prices, but with other things. I believe that Obama has looked at the Russian scenario right now and determined that it is likely that Russia's economy will fall further, and then it will stagnate, and it will be a long time, if ever, before they actually recover and regain the capability to really throw their economic weight around. I mean, the deal with India might not even go through because of their own economic problems. The deal with China was stymied to a great extent by the Chinese haggling with the Russians. And what you may see now is a situation in which the low oil prices putting pressure on Venezuela, which is really the intermediary for the Cubans, as well as depressing the Russian economy, plus Russia's general weakness, its general sanction-driven weakness in the world at large, has compounded together into a very fruitful situation for the Western world in which we might be able to rip some of these countries out of Russia's general sphere. Including Venezuela, which any day now, a single protester getting shot or beaten in the street could lead to revolution in Venezuela. The amount of protectionism and isolationism that they've undergone, the fact that their economy is so fragile, so close to collapse, the fact that they need oil to be 100 per barrel to even break even on their economy, has largely destroyed their nation. People are seeing continual shortages, and there have been marches, there have been protests and rallies. And every time that happens, the government there, largely, has said, but look at the United States that's keeping us so poor, it's all their fault. By making overtures to the Cubans and getting word out about the fact that we're receptive and we're no longer going to act in a draconian manner towards these states, we might be able to encourage the people there to throw off the socialist and communist governments that have kept them so poor for so long, allowing them to join the world at large once they then get to see how powerful their countries can really be. Cuba has potentially a good economy. Venezuela has potentially a massive economy. They've got the largest proven oil reserves on the face of the earth. There's no reason they should be so poor. There's no reason that they should have any of these shortages. They should be wealthy. They should be like essentially the equivalent of what Qatar is in the Middle East or something like that. They should have the skyscrapers and the gleaming parks and all the wealth flowing into the coffers, even if they keep socialism. If it trickles down to the rest of the population through some redistribution network, people there should essentially have to work like 10 hours a week and still live like kings. And once these people realize this, I think this is the hope of Obama, once we can sort of blunt the Russians' effects on these economies and draw them further west, they will then join the world at large. There will no longer be any Russia-backed countries in this hemisphere. We can clear the entire American hemisphere simply by removing these countries from Russia's sphere. I think that's what he's banking on. I think Obama looked at the economic situation and said, it is my prediction, me speaking as Obama here, that oil will continue to slough off. It probably won't rise back up to the prices it was at. If it does, it'll take years to do so. The Russian economy, in the meantime, is weak. Russia does not have the capability to fully modernize its military. It might have to cut positions. It might have to take some sort of other draconian measures, protectionism, in order to shield its own people from starvation. If that happens, Russia destabilizes, potentially has its own regime change. It will no longer be capable of influencing events in places like Venezuela and Cuba. In order to take advantage of that situation, though, you have to allow the Cubans to take their first steps into the world at large. If you keep them embargoed, and you keep empowering their draconian government by allowing them to use us as a scapegoat for every time things go wrong, nothing happens. Eventually, the Russians come back, if their economy manages to do so, and they go right back to backing these economies, and potentially in the future might be more powerful than they are now. But right now, we have to take advantage of the world situation. Right now, you see an empowered West, which you haven't seen for the last decade, and you have a very weak Eastern world. And that includes, by the way, the Chinese, whose economy has begun to stagnate as well. The fact that Russia's economy is on such a tremendous downswing has completely changed our capability to influence events in this hemisphere. And Obama, for all of his weakness in the Middle East crisis that we've seen, for all of his mismanagement, his weakness, and largely his hypocrisy in a lot of these theaters, he has been right about Cuba and has been all along. And he hasn't wavered from the fact that he wanted Cuba to not suffer so many embargoes and so much sort of humiliation at the hands of the United States. And to the Cuban population of this country, to the Cuban Americans who are saying, well, you shouldn't be negotiating with Castro, he's Satan, essentially. I would say, don't you wish that your people back in actual Cuba, your extended family there, can rejoin the world, and you could someday go back to Cuba without worrying about Castro, without worrying about communism and protectionism and constant invasive interventionism? Don't you want Cuba to be as developed as some of the other states within the region, that they do have industry? They are part of the Western world. They do have free trade. They don't have constant shortages and oppression and generic homegrown inferior goods and communist radio stations and stuff. Now, I like listening to commie radio stations as much as the next person, but ultimately I don't want to see millions of people put through that sort of poverty and oppression simply so that I can listen to the Cuban, shortwave radio. The same goes for Venezuela. There is no reason, economically speaking, that these countries have to be so poor. Cuba could, even as a tobacco monoculture, they could have a larger economy than they have now. Venezuela has all the oil it could possibly ever need, but the problem is oil is falling by the wayside, and if the Venezuelans do not, in the next, I would say, decade or so, join the Western world, begin heavily extracting it and using it to prop up the growth of infrastructure and of other industry, they will remain a third world nation forever, because they will never have the infrastructure in place to become competitive with the rest of the world. There is a narrow window, and I would warn all nations out there that are developing or capable of developing, that have fuel resources, mineral resources, whatever. You have a narrow window right now of perhaps a decade, maybe a little bit shorter or longer, in which you can catch up to some of the most developed countries in the world. You can drastically increase your infrastructure if you're willing to invest, but you have to be able to trade. That may mean that you will need loans from the Western world. If that happens, so be it. Oil prices will probably end up rising. So for a state like Venezuela that has all the oil in the world but largely is extracting it for its own use or not extracting it at all, I would say take the investment or invest in it yourselves. Find some way to do that. Make your money now, enhance your infrastructure, build the rails, build the roads, build the skyscrapers and parks, build the academies and universities, put everything into place, improve the land, do everything that you need to do to become a stable, coherent first world nation, which Venezuela could very easily do. It could become not just first world, but extraordinarily advanced first world. It'd be on the order of something like Japan or the UK. It could do that within just a decade. It could do that if it put a concerted effort into it and if it was in the world at large. The problem is their isolationism is preventing any enhancement. Protectionism and interventionism do not work except in a very few cases and in very limited amounts, and usually for a short span of time. The only reason to use protectionism is to protect something of particular importance that's being absorbed internally for short periods of time because you have no other choice. It should be a last-ditch effort, a last-ditch, a last resort, and it hasn't been used as such. But for Obama to open up to the Cubans and try to get them to come out of the tortoiseshell, peek their head out, and see how the world at large works, I think is a good idea. Because if Cuba undergoes revolution, undergoes democratic elections, undergoes any sort of change, even if it ends up as a quasi-socialist state, even if it remains far left and just begins trading some with the Western world, their economy will very swiftly pick up as a result. Even if they adopted something along the lines of the Chinese model, they would be far better off than they are as the very insular state that they are today. They've only got really two trade partners: Venezuela, whose economy appears to be collapsing, and Russia, whose economy, if not collapsing, is at very least sliding back into the Stone Age, depriving them of a lot of their leverage when it comes to political issues. The thing is, Russia has no problem influencing the Ukrainians. It has no problem influencing things that are physically, geographically connected to its country or geographically connected to them through friendly territory. It has no problem with that because the travel is easy. The distance is short. They can always point a few missiles at somebody that they don't like and say, ha ha. But as far as Venezuela and Cuba goes, they're in the Americas. They're not in Asia. They're not in Europe or North Africa or the Middle East or one of these places in relative proximity to Russia. And Russia's naval power and their air power, their projective ability is far less than that of the United States. It's far easier for the United States to put pressure on a foreign theater than it is for the Russians to do so. The fact is, the Russians may lack in the next year or so the capability to influence Venezuela at all. But if Venezuela falls and undergoes regime change, we're then left with this little tiny nation right off Florida, this Cuban nation, which would remain insular, potentially collapse altogether without Venezuelan trade if the Venezuelans move towards the West. And then what do? We can invade, even if it's for the purpose of ousting a government that's overseeing its people starving in the streets. We can't do that because of Russia. We have no other option but to open up the world at large to the Cuban people and hope that they take the opportunity to join it. We don't have another choice, because if Russia falters, if Russia does undergo a 10-year recession or something like that, if Russia really does collapse and balkanize or suffers from stagnation for the next 10 years, there will be no other option. The Cubans will begin starving, so will the Venezuelans. The Venezuelans may be a little bit more open to some of the other countries in the world. They may be able to join the world at large. The Cubans have not. It's important, thus, that we do. I think that Obama's got it completely right. In fact, if I was Obama, I would freeze all the embargoes. I would say, okay, well, they can trade if they want with the United States. And I'd give them a good old taste of American capitalism. And when people wake up to the fact that it's so much better than the system that they're using, then they probably would overthrow the Castro regime. One of the reasons, I think, why the embargoes have been set in place is specifically to keep them from doing that, because until now, the worry, I think, and this is just my feeling, I think the worry was that the Cuban people would attempt to revolt, and then all of a sudden Russians would begin showing up on their shores, and then we would have Russian military in Cuba. By keeping them embargoed and by keeping them impoverished and by continuing to allow the communist dictators over there to blame us for everything, we at least keep the Russians out, because even if it is fragile and largely destabilized at any given time, they're going to keep blaming us and the communists stay in power. And as long as they stay in power, the Russians aren't concerned with landing their own troops here, and we don't have another Cuban Missile Crisis to worry about or anything similar to that. What happens if they destabilize without entering the Western world at large, because we can protect them if they choose to do that, because they're right there off the coast of Florida. What happens then? If all of a sudden a couple of Russian warships unload a few thousand troops into Cuba? Well, we certainly can't do anything about it. We wouldn't be able to do anything. I think that's the concern that's always been there, is that the Russians, upon Cuba actually destabilizing, would be right on our doorstep again, just like they were in the 1960s. I think Venezuela is largely the same way. Why do you think that there have only been a few attempts made to prop up some of the center-left parties in that country, which they call far-right, but that's nonsense? Why do you think that there hasn't been more done by the U.S. government to try to actually encourage those parties to grow and take control? Because they know that if that happens, the Russians might end up showing up the next day. But now it looks like Russia will lack the capability to actually do that. I think this is a smart move by Obama. I would not be surprised to see additional moves made towards the Venezuelans. And again, the right-wingers, the Republican sort of war hawks that are decrying this as sort of pacifying the communists, don't seem to understand the goal of Obama in this seems to be to prevent them from remaining communist. And I do not personally believe Obama is a Kenyan communist or any of these things. I think he's crazed, I think he's a hypocrite, and I think that he's been largely a completely ineffective president who probably deserved to be impeached long ago. But if this works out, that would be a redeeming facet to his presidency. What you may see is that unexpectedly, much like the fall of the USSR before, you could see essentially a reset on Russia once again that, puts its economy back another 10 years. And then all of a sudden these other states begin drying up. The thing is, if they're marginally westernized to begin with, then they won't collapse. They will simply rejoin the rest of the world at large and things will be peachy keen. What we don't want is a bunch of states on our doorstep in the Americas collapsing entirely and allowing the Russians a cause to move in to restore order just like they did in Crimea. I think that's the worry. So I support Obama on this. I think this is a good idea. I would go much further if I was him. I think he's treading lightly specifically because he knows he's getting backlash. He'll do this, he'll wait a while for the backlash to die down, and he'll do something else. Maybe towards Cuba again, maybe towards Venezuela. If you see the Cubans begin making any tentative moves towards sort of a peaceful relationship with the United States, that will be the death knell, I think, of the Russian sort of empire. I think that would happen because it would be clear that they no longer have the capability of maintaining states outside of Eurasia, essentially. And you've seen, by the way, you've seen Iran, for the first time in many years, actually say something friendly towards the Western world. Now, of course, there's going to be a long transitional period where they sort of waffle between the West and the East. But you've seen that. For the very first time, the Iranians have actually softballed the United States. For the very first time, the Chinese agreed to sanctions on North Korea. Right now, the entire Russian sphere as it was in the 1970s or 80s is in complete uproar. And Putin doesn't understand what's going on because, as I pointed out, he's living in the 70s. He believes that the USSR can still come back, and he's wrong. Once an empire begins this type of collapse, once an empire has hemorrhaged that large an amount of land, it doesn't come back. They never have and they never will. It will collapse back into potato patch status before it has any opportunity to rebuild. It has to regain sort of ethno-state status and revert to the 1/3 of that land area that comprises White Russia, minus Chechnya, in order for it to sort of reset itself, rebuild, focus on its own internalization, and then re-expand. And that would take perhaps a century to do. I don't think it's going to happen in our lifetimes. I think you're going to see, as we're alive, specifically, I would say in the next decade or so, you'll see the Eastern world continue to fragment. The West, meanwhile, will become more powerful than ever. And all of these propagandists, they keep saying that the Western world is not long for this world and Russia will rise and engulf all and it'll be peace and communism forever. They couldn't be more wrong. And they also they lack just as much understanding about the economy. They lack just as much understanding about diplomacy as the same people that are attacking Obama right now for opening up to Cuba. which is a largely demilitarized state at this point. They don't really have a functioning economy outside of their own little landmass. What are they going to do? Float a couple of PT boats to Florida and take pot shots at one of the lighthouses? It's just not going to happen. So yeah, Obama gets it right on this one. Begrudging credit where it's due. Yeah, he's right on Cuba. And the Republicans are completely and utterly wrong and probably, let's face it, pandering to that Cuban voting bloc in Florida, which also seems to have ignored the fact that if they rejoin the world at large, you won't need to worry about the Castros anymore because there'll be a footnote in history. What part don't you understand about that? So yeah, that's about all. Peace out.